Okay.
Works.
Okay, we're going to get started.
Good.
I'm not accustomed to something like this. We're going to get started, and as you can see, I'm not Dal Giuliani. I'm slightly different. Actually, there's a joke there, but I'm not going to get too far into it. But when we go to Johnny C's for lunch, we're known as father and son. And I'm not going to tell you which one is the father and which one is the son. But Dal is not here. He called me later in the day. He sounded under the weather. He said he was under the weather, so he won't be here this evening. Fortunately, we have a very light agenda. Dan is going to walk us through the agenda, and we have Lee on the phone. We have some technical problems with the video and with the other communication, but we're going to have to work through that. And I think because of the nature of the work we have this evening that we'll be able to accommodate that. This is mostly going to be about providing you with information and asking you to begin to work on that information during the next month and during the next meeting, and we'll come to some conclusions in regard to how we actually use that information to move forward with the study. But the next thing I wanted to talk with you about is something which is very difficult for me, and that is that many of you have heard that Gary Black is leaving, that he is going to, tomorrow is going to be his last day. And it goes without saying that there's going to be a huge hole in the planning staff as a result of Gary leaving. He's going to be taking a big, that's right, physically and from an experience point of view. I mean, a lot of the economic vitality of this community is the responsibility of Gary Black. And a lot of the quality of the development we see out there is also his responsibility. And the fact that the community is able to get through the development review process in an expeditious way is largely responsible for the work that he's done here. He has been a great staff asset. He's always been looking for ways to improve the process, and as of today, he was still trying to do that, and hopefully I'm going to be able to tap into him from time to time. He hasn't given me a clue as to what he's going to be doing. I know that he's not retiring. He's going to be doing something else. So hopefully we'll get to see him again in the future in some role, helping the town and keeping it as vibrant and as great as it really is. So I'm going to really miss the guy. I've actually stopped crying, but I'm going to be just fine. But we are going to miss him. Personally, I'm going to miss him. Without him, it's like losing a right arm. I don't know at this point in time what we're going to be doing in terms of staff alignment, but that's something which will unfold over time. I wish him well on his next endeavor, and whoever is going to get the benefit of his services, they're very, very lucky people. Dan is going to begin to take us through the process that we're assigned this evening. And again, we're somewhat hamstrung by the technology that we have. I did want to mention in introducing Dan that we are also in the process within the town hall of looking at the possibility of providing a venue like this with the AV equipment that which would be state-of-the-art, that would allow us to have meetings like this in the town hall with much better AV equipment and with the ability to do the streaming video, which I think is essential to continue to engage the residents of our town and all the planning that we do in the community. So without further ado, I'm going to let Dan take over.
Good evening, everyone. I think the first order of business is to look at our meeting notes from last month and identify any changes that you may or may not want to discuss at this point. If there are no comments, then someone wants to make a motion or just indicate that you're good to go with those notes, we'll proceed from there. Duncan, you got a microphone there in front of you. You want to? It should be on. Was on. Testing. It's good.
I'll move. Approval is written.
Okay. Second, anywhere?
I'll second that.
Here, any discussion, any comments? Otherwise, we're okay to accept the notes as presented. And hearing no comments and we'll go ahead and accept those notes. Tonight's meeting is really about getting down into the details of our comprehensive plan amendment. That's remember, that's one portion of this project. One was to develop an amendment to the plan to guide from a policy level the commercial and mixed-use centers we have in the town. The next step beyond this will be to consider zoning, but that zoning needs to be informed and guided by the comprehensive plan. And so we've taken the time over the last several months to think about designs for different types of places in the town. Just as an aside, we received acceptance for the precedent report and the summary report for the charrette. Both current versions or final versions are posted to the website, and NYSERDA has given us their blessing on both of those. So the renderings and the drawings that we had resulting from the charrette process give us some idea as to what might be possible in those types of areas. Again, as we discussed last time, they're not meant to be solid plans for redevelopment of those areas. Those areas were serving as examples of places that different forms of development might take place. Now we have to kind of look at the map of the town and begin to understand what the forms and types of centers might be across the town. And from here, and Lee will get into this in a little more detail, we'll start to talk about what the attributes of those different forms and types might be. And when we finish, hopefully we'll have a plan map, a map somewhat like you see in front of you, that identifies locations and extent and types and forms of center, and then there'll be a little bit more detailed discussion of those in the comprehensive plan, and then ultimately the code will be developed to implement those types of centers in those particular areas. Lee, is that about right for a quick summary?
Yes, no, I think that's very good. Thank you.
Okay. So, without getting into this any further, do you want to go ahead and get started and kind of take us through the map and so we can understand what we've got in front of us?
Yes. I think I'd like to start by saying the reason for the exercise that you're going through right now is to lead us to the zoning. We have a fairly strong sense of where it might head on the basis of the work during the charrette, but it's always good for us then to widen out from the set of centers that we were looking at to look at all of the affected centers and see whether our theoretical framework is holding up. So this is the job that you are being tasked with. We've now applied that framework at the staff and consultant level to the map that you have before you, and I'm going to walk you through how the framework and the typologies work. But we need this to be, in the end, intuitive to users like you, that yes, these centers are categorized correctly according to basically two parameters that we're going to talk about. One is kind of the context in which they're currently built or embedded, or the imagined future context in a few cases, and the other is really about a little bit more about their character for the center itself, for the commercial area itself. So let's start. You should have in front of you an 8.5 by 11 sheet with some photographs on it, street shots that is dated 1/10/17 that says traditional form on the left and suburban form on the right. Everybody figured out where that one is? So, boiled down to its simplest, when we spent time driving around town, when we looked at the centers that we were dealing with, there's really fundamentally two patterns in which commercial and mixed-use centers occur today in Amherst. And those two patterns are a traditional main street, whether the large one in the center of Williamsville or the smaller ones that you find in Eggertsville and Snyder, a very traditional form in which the building itself is pulled up to the sidewalk. There is no front setback. The buildings are not pushed back. The street trees are often found in grates and embedded in the streetscape. There's typically on-street parking buffering the pedestrian on the sidewalk. The parking for the facility is on-street and then back behind or to the side of the building. The signs come in the form primarily of wall signs on the building itself, and the adjacent roadway speed in most cases is going to be what people would consider low or slow, 15 to 30 miles an hour, for example. Someplace that in essence is walkable by pedestrians on the sidewalk because of the protected character, with trees for shade, with parking nearby, and shopfront windows, pulled up right next to you. That is one of the forms that I think is an undeniable part of Amherst history and a desirable part of moving forward in the town, is that traditional form. In addition to that, there is a suburban form. And I don't want you to think that the suburban form is not walkable, because in fact, as is shown on the picture there, there's a sidewalk there. There's a sidewalk that goes up to the front of the building, but it is not the same as walking past the main street. It actually sits back behind a parking lot, and the majority of users are, parking in that parking lot and walking to the building from the parking lot, not from the adjacent sidewalk. The buildings are set back from the street. The front setback is either totally landscaped, just green space, or there's some parking in between the building and the street. The street trees, instead of being in that more urban style of trees and grates, in a suburban setting, they would normally be found in a tree lawn, like in the picture. There is not usually any on-street parking. The adjacent street is usually a bigger, faster street, and therefore on-street parking is not usually designated along the edges of it. The parking in this case, there's a modest amount in the front in this example, but there's more to the side and rear. So you still find side and rear parking, but you do find that little bit of teaser parking in the front that makes everybody feel like they've got a safe, protected spot right in front of the business. Often there are monument signs. As you can see here, the sign between the sidewalk and the parking area that is focused on the traveling public is actually a separate standalone structure. There are also then wall signs on the building, but there's the added cost and the duplicated infrastructure of a sidewalk in front of the building, signs on the building, as you would have in a traditional form, but then also we have to double that up out at the street with another sidewalk and another sign in order to capture the passersby. Adjacent road speed typically in these suburban settings is posted at more like 35 or 45 miles an hour. These are bigger, faster roads in most cases. Now, this does not mean that you couldn't enter a suburban site, as we showed on the Northtown example, and inside have a little walkable main street within the development. So it's not like these two forms can't be very close to each other. It's just that that suburban form would be found along the outside edges of the project. So, does anyone have any questions about those two sort of fundamental differences in the existing pattern and proposed future pattern of development in the town? We good?
Doesn't look like it, Lee.
Okay. Let's go on. Hopefully you have a second page which has center, corridor, and node on it. So this piece is, while the first piece is more about what is the fabric of the surrounding area and how embedded is this thing. A traditional main street is embedded directly into a neighborhood typically, whereas the suburban one may stand alone as a separate node. this piece here is about the form within the center itself, and not so much about the framework of what's surrounding the center, such as the street or the immediately adjacent neighborhood. So we've described what we think are only 3 flavors here that can be used to categorize the whole town. And so here we have the largest, most intense thing. We've simply, for the moment, called it a center. Whether that's the perfect word or not doesn't really matter. But there is a category, a group of some kind, that for the most part is not located very near single-family residential. It's more of an isolated thing. It is along major highways, at the highway intersections, or near the interstate changes. The parcels are quite large and typically deep as well. The buildings then have the opportunity, or are already today, higher than you would find in the other kinds of centers in the town. This is the only tall buildings in town would fall into this area. And right this minute, I'm not going to tell you that higher is exactly this or that or the other thing. I just want you to think of it as taller than most of everything that's in town. This is the exception and not the rule. The remaining 2, then, corridors are fairly self-explanatory. They are typically along the larger roads, along the highways. They often have shallow parcel depths related to the fact that there are neighborhoods immediately behind them. And here the buildings are anticipated to be lower. And I'll just let the cat out of the bag and say by lower in this case, I think in most instances, you have 1-story buildings, but you could have 2 or 3-story buildings, but probably not more than that in the corridors. The node is the smallest component then, definitely embedded in neighborhoods, near single family. It is often at highway intersections that are serving the neighborhoods. Major roadways that are coming together create that node to create enough activity to support the market life of that node. This is where the shallowest parcel depths show up. And again, these buildings are lower. They're not necessarily lower than the corridor, but they are substantially lower than the center. And this is meant to be a smaller thing than the center. So these 3 flavors here, times the 2 flavors we talked about on the first page, give you 6 possible flavors to put on the map. And so, if you glance at the map, you'll see we have 3 suburban and center, corridor, and node, and 3 traditional designations, center, corridor, and node. So the same sort of size and scale within that difference in the fabric surrounding them and their immediately abutting streets and characteristics like whether they're pulled up or not pulled up. So when you look at the map and the colors designated on there, you'll see that for the most part, traditional nodes, for example, the darkest blue there, are in the oldest portion of the community, where they arose originally before we had the interstate system and other components, before we were really building at that scale for our commercial centers. There are just a couple of traditional just 1 traditional corridor piece really designated. That's down in the southwest corner. You'll see 13, 14, and 16, the little pieces down there of Bailey, and I don't remember what the other one is that comes right along the border with UB there. But that is the one place that traditional corridor is found. And you'll also see 1 traditional center there, 15, the designated area there. In addition, then, sorry, I used my phone incorrectly. So, the technological challenges are not just on your end. So, we talked about the traditional ones. The suburban centers are shown mostly in areas where there are deep and large lots. So Niagara Falls, Sheridan, Transit Road, and there is one piece shown up along Millersport there. The corridor portions are those thinner pieces then that don't have those deeper and larger lots, and those show up in a number of places on many of the corridors in town. And finally, the suburban nodes show up in very specialized little locations, similar to the traditional nodes that are down in the southwest, and these are really in the central portion of the community, the majority of them, and one all the way up in the northeast. So what you're seeing here is what we think intuitively to you should make sense as, yes, that's the kind of centers these are, that is a corridor, yes, that's just a little node. What we're hoping to do is get all of you to agree that we have designated these places correctly and that we do not need any additional types in order to characterize the set of centers that's colored here. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't show you one more thing on this map, which is that we have taken out many of the specialized centers, and we took out a portion. If you look along Millersport in the northeast, there's a site there which is designated for T&D, in which the majority of the site is anticipated to be residential. We've taken out a significant portion of the site as not in the suburban corridor designation, but actually assumed to be future residential there. So you can see we've taken out the hospital, we've taken out the piece to the east of UB, and some of the other parcels that have very particular characteristics and are not generally seen as the standard commercial mixed-use activity center. So, having gone through that, are there questions about either of the 8.5 by 11 pages or about how the map works?
Lee, Daniel Wachowski. Lee, I'm looking at what's being defined as node number 56, which is actually the aerial image that you're using in your 8.5 by 11. And my primary question is, it looks like some of the suburban nodes, they're not really nodes, but that you're isolating individual pieces of land. Now, if we were to look at the visual image you provide in your 8.5 by 11 of the node, that's the intersection of Maple and Air, and we're only singling out the gas station and the convenience plaza just north of that, so it would be the northeast corner, two parcels. I mean, my impression of a node is something a little more larger than that in geography, and I guess my question to you is, the map that's being presented, we're looking at this as potentially a future land use map, and should not the geography include more than just those two parcels for that particular node? I also look at 54, 57, 62, and I mean, if I look at the node at Maple and Air, the southeast quadrant, we've got some administrative offices, and then if we look to the northwest quadrant, we have a church, and east of that, vacant land. I mean, what should we not be looking at what the image of that entire node should be in the next 20 years?
That is a great question. So, one of the exercises that the staff went through, working with some guidance from us in this time, was to strip away the non-commercial zoning from these. So that church, if I were just guessing, I don't have the zoning in front of me, but I think someone there has it, is probably public facilities. The office is probably OB, it looks like maybe senior living or something in the southwest corner of that. And that would be, again, could be designated public facilities today. So that's the reason you ended up with the so-called node being only probably what is GB or NB zoned land in that northeast quadrant. You are correct. Any of those other three quadrants could be redeveloped as part of that node. There's no doubt. Of this information in the comprehensive plan is going to be to think through and constrain where commercial zoning is used in the future. And the principal reason for that is the sense that we're getting from the work that has been done in the past for the town, and the sense of where the economics of retail are headed suggests that there is plenty of retail here, including retail that is serving the entire region, especially on Transit and Niagara Falls Boulevard. The remaining retail, and especially in an area like this node, is serving only the immediate neighborhood. And having a larger center, for example, large enough to accommodate a grocery store up there, isn't necessarily something that the market is going to respond to. So, right this minute, we have narrowed these centers down. We are open to finishing this conversation and to you guys really holding it among yourselves at the next meeting about whether that's an appropriate approach or whether we really should be planning for there to be a more robust node at all four corners of the intersection. I do think when you look at the aerial, it's clearly a node. Now, the fact that only 1/4 of it is commercial doesn't change that fact that all four corners of the intersection are not single-family or low-density residential, like the rest of the fabric of the town. So this is a different thing. Should we designate the whole different thing or only the commercial and mixed-use part of it is definitely an open question for the working committee to discuss with the planning staff when you look at these node by node. So it's excellent that you pointed that out. What was done intentionally. It's not an accident, but it could well be that that we go back and expand again a few of these nodes, not all of them, but a few of these nodes to include additional land that we could see being rezoned commercially in the future.
I appreciate the reply, Lee. I guess as a member of the planning board, I'm going to try to look for some guidance in this document as to what if I were to get a request for something more intensive west of the church. Do I, support something that they would like as an applicant for a suburban node? Or do I, am I rigid in this geography?
That's a really good question. So here's the intent of the document. That's a wonderful sort of setup for me to explain how the document could work. So one manner in which the document itself, the comprehensive plan amendment, these additional pages that go with this map, could provide you with criteria for making decisions about expanding those places. And this one would be a great example. That site that you are talking about looks like it's close enough to all of the other things that you could consider it part of a walkable node that's there. But an applicant, if we leave the map as is, an applicant would have to do a two-step. And that two-step would be come through, amend the plan, come through, ask for the zoning. So that you are having that discussion not at the zoning level and looking at his design and all of that, but rather at the plan level and saying, is this site appropriate for the whole package of uses that might go with this being commercial? Or is that simply not appropriate because one of the roads doesn't have enough capacity, or because it's so close to the neighbors, or whatever the other points of discussion would be. It allows you to have what I would call a planning first discussion and then a zoning discussion. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I guess to amend a comprehensive plan is a laborious project, or process rather. I mean, when you seek a rezoning, obviously that's a legislative prerogative, and the planning board's only an advisory role, but in any event, you're still looking at the long-term consequences of that change in allowable land uses for everything, not just what's presented in a site plan. So I don't know if I necessarily agree that you should change the comprehensive plan and then seek a rezoning. So, maybe we need to have some discussions on what kind of guidance the land use map will provide, or
absolutely.
And I'll leave it at that. I don't want to.
That pure process question has definitely got to be put on the table at some point in time, because the comprehensive plan, as you know, could act either way. You could continue to sort of amend the map through zoning changes, be amending the future land use guidance through zoning changes, or you can consider the plan first and foremost. It kind of depends on, the validity you feel that the plan document has. And you happen to have pointed out, an excellent example that perhaps we should be adding in and offering up that it is possible in the future to zone that to a commercial zoning. What we don't want to happen is every square inch of Miller's Court, every remaining square inch of Transit Road, every inch of Sheridan or Maple, to slowly become substandard depth commercial parcels with nominal uses on them. It's not a good, efficient pattern for land use planning. It's not an effective thing to have happening in the community. Your density is not high enough to support it, etc. So it's really the opposite that I am the most worried about. I would be quite comfortable including additional land in various nodes. What I would be less comfortable with is finding ourselves stripping out in large corridors components that have not been used for that in the past.
Thank you very much, Lee.
You should, when you have that discussion, I would only offer up that it would have been interesting to have a planning first discussion about both Westwood and Gun Club, rather than leaping all the way down into the details of exactly how many houses, exactly how much open space, is it going to be affordable or not affordable, all of those things that have happened in your conversations because they have been about a very specific development.
Dan, I wanted to add something to what Lee has said. Looking back at what our charge was to look at the commercial zoning in the town, the commercial areas in the town, and then to rationalize those in terms of their function. And I'll use that term rather loosely here. And I think that part of the exercise we have with us is about that rationalization process. So I think we need to really focus on the existing commercial areas. It is not our charge to make recommendations as to how that might be expanded. In regard to, you have a node like this which seems really small. The reason why it's so small is because it focuses on just the commercial component of that node. We have in the past included in the comprehensive plan the very stringent criteria for how a particular area, particular land use node might be expanded, providing that criteria. And that can be used, and it is being used in terms of how we review projects. It is not absolutely necessary that in order to make those determinations and expand those nodes within the criteria set down in the comprehensive plan, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to go and do a comprehensive plan amendment. Obviously, it's something that we're going to need to address as we get farther down the road, is exactly how we do that.
So I guess the end result, and especially with careful reformulation there, please look carefully at the sectors we have designated, and let's figure out first and foremost whether we have these ones designated correctly. Then, if there are additional elements I think that can be a next step for the committee to figure out what those are and whether those should be added or not in conjunction with the staff. But first and foremost, it would be good if you would look at the ones which are colored today on the new version of the map that you have in your hand.
Another question, Lee.
Hello, Lily. This is Ramona. My question is, along Main Street there in Snyder, Negetsville, you've designated in several areas there as a traditional node. And when you were describing the centers and corridor nodes, you were talking about the different heights, but you really didn't mention the height for the node. You said it was close to the neighborhood, shallow, lower than the center. What height are you recommending for the traditional node there?
Also, at that lower maximum height, my tendency right this minute, if I were to wave my personal magic wand only, would be that those would max out at 3 stories.
What about 2 stories?
Go ahead.
What about 2 stories?
2 stories is a possibility. It is shorter. It definitely, it's half of what would be allowed today. So it's a pretty severe change. If you look at many of the drawings that we prepared, it might not be necessary. There are 3-story buildings in these areas today, including, downtown in Williamsville, that I think people would consider are good prototypes for use in those settings. So that question is still open. So I'll say for the moment, 2 or 3 stories for the moment. And yes, we as a group have to figure that out for the plan amendment.
Okay, thank you.
Lee, it's Rick again. My understanding of the charge here is to make sure that we have these center designations correct. The previous activities that we had talked about heights. My understanding is that once we get these center designations correct, then we can then begin to craft language, first of all, comprehensive plan language, and then based upon that code language, which would give us another opportunity to revisit the idea of what heights would be appropriate in each one of those districts. So that by making these designations, we are not automatically making a designation in regard to height.
That is also correct, yes.
Okay.
With the exception that the tallest heights belong in center. So if you think something has a 10-story Marriott in it, you better call it a center. But yes, short of that question, we are talking about future intensities for these places, and we're talking about them in very gross level language right this minute. You might see, let's use Ramona's example, you might see a toolkit in which there is the exact same district with a 2-story height and a 3-story height, and if it's absolutely critical that in one portion of the community traditional nodes be 2 stories in height, you would apply the zoning for 2 stories, but the 3-story zoning would also be available according to the comprehensive plan, and of course then subject to the town board's final decision making about the appropriate zoning. So it is possible that there could be a toolkit with some breadth that implements these colors. How much breadth in terms of the traditional and in terms of the pattern of development? Very little change from the existing pattern of development that's described there, pulled up to the street, etc. But the height question of 2 or 3 stories, those could be 2 options available in the zoning toolkit, and one or the other pulled out and applied to each of these places.
Any other questions thus far?
Lee, it's Gary Palumbo. I have a question about, I guess, a subtle difference between center and corridor. The suburban centers, there's a couple that seem to be on smaller, relatively smaller parcels or areas, and surrounded by a lot of, backing up to a lot of residential. And I'm wondering why they would be centers and not corridors. And number 42 and number 43 along Sheridan are two of them. I'm not quite sure how the Wegmans at Alberta along Maple works, if that stretch along Maple is a corridor or a center.
Let's go through them. You can ask me about some other ones. I'm stuck on 42 and 43. 42 and 43 are in the center category because they're near the interstate. That's the principal reason. They could clearly be designated for corridor. They don't really sit along a corridor roadway, unfortunately. They sit along, a power line right away, etc. So from that perspective, it's hard to think, especially of 42, which reaches, fairly deeply there away from the corridor, as being a corridor parcel. If you look at the pink parcels to the west of there, 45 and 46, that's what corridor would typically more look like. So these are, from that perspective, these are actually larger and deeper than the other corridor parcels. Plus, they're at the freeway interchange. But you had some others you wanted to ask about as well.
Well, just to stick with that concept, I guess my concern is, to play devil's advocate, is height and the proximity to residences, which is why I'm trying to be more careful about suburban center versus suburban corridor. That's the heart of my question.
Very, very sensible. Yes, we'll have to craft the right tool for managing height adjacent to residential use. And that tool might actually substantially impact 43, given that while it is a fairly large parcel in the scheme of things, it is also immediately abutting those two residential neighborhoods on two sides. If there were something like a bulk lane or something else, you might find you could never achieve whatever the designated height was. So would you be better off in that case simply applying corridor, which you might be able to reach the height on instead? Perhaps. So you could be right. I think as we dig a little deeper in the tools, these ones that sit in your head in a problematic location and maybe should flip to something else, that's the conversation you guys should be holding next is to try and make some of those judgment calls. We also get to second guess ourselves once the zoning toolkit is available, and we could actually apply that to some of those parcels and say, if we actually use these transitional tools that we're proposing to have in the zoning, that site can never get to center intensity. Please don't designate it that way. Don't give people the sense that they should be asking for more height than they could possibly get on those parcels. So point well taken. Those are, I can tell you why they were designated, but I can also see how they could be designated corridor instead.
Thank you. That's all I had.
Lee, can you just go through what you'd like folks to do with this information over the next several weeks until we meet again?
So there's two important things about this map from our perspective. One is, if you look across the community, are these 6 flavors enough? Or is there something here that we have missed that is measurable and quantifiable and we can include as a differentiator to make some additional category that you think more successfully handles some of the centers? That's kind of the first one is, are these 6 kinds of ideas enough, assuming that they get implemented with a fairly uniform set of rules that is different by color, but not very much different within the same colored thing. In other words, we mentioned with Ramona, the traditional node might be 2 or 3 stories. Not a whole lot of difference there, an important nuance perhaps for some neighborhoods, but a very nuanced thing in the scheme of looking at the whole town. As opposed to traditional center, which might have higher height, even though it's built up to the street. It is as much as anything confirming this typology that we have provided here, the designations themselves, that gives us enough differentiation. And then the second half of it is, once you've said that's enough tools, did we apply the right one in the right places? As Gary was asking, there is the question of, should 43 be a corridor and not a center, right? And that is fair game as well. So those are the 2 questions and please, I think the biggest challenge for everybody is looking at places that are not the places they normally go in Amherst. So if you're from Southwest Amherst, go to East Amherst, or go up to the north side and look at some centers up there. Try to, especially the ones that you think might be problematic based on their designations, try to actually go have a look, stand there, tell me how close the single family is, tell me this is not appropriate for additional height, tell me it's not appropriate to pull this area up to the street because it's already set back. Whatever those things that would make these centers act differently than what we have defined here, those are kind of what we're looking for. So this is our best cut working with the staff, and your job is to intuitively help us figure out whether these 6 work. We think they do, but we need your confirmation.
I wanted to add something to what Lee has just said, in that what you have before you are working documents. They are drafts. I anticipate that as a result of your work and after the meeting in February, there'll be some significant changes to it. So I suggest you take those home and work on them. They're not for public distribution at this point in time. When you finish with your work on these maps and they're finalized, then they'll be posted to the website. So I'd ask you to be a little circumspect in terms of how the documents are being used at this point in time.
Any questions on Lee's direction for these?
Just one quick question. So, maybe I just, in the passage of time, forgot some things. So the entire new community district is kind of not part of this. So we've talked in the past about how the whole corridor of John James Audubon, say between Dodge Road to North Forest Road, is probably ripe for redevelopment of some sort, and yet it's not reflected on here. Is that, I'm trying to remember why we did that, or was there a conscious decision made outside this committee to keep that gray?
Dan, I missed much of that. Is that something you could answer?
Yeah, stand by. Rick's going to deal with that one.
I just want to get geographically clear. Are you talking about the UV parcel along Norrisport Highway?
No, I'm talking about the whole John James Audubon corridor that runs between University of Buffalo and, say, the 990 Expressway at Muir Woods.
Up by Muir Woods.
And they have all that office development there that's we've talked about here is kind of tired, one of the worst suburban office markets in the town that may be ripe for redevelopment. You think you'd want to have that somehow incorporated into this comprehensive planning process. I wasn't sure why we left it gray.
I think, as I indicated early on, is our charge was to look at the existing commercially zoned areas. That area is not commercially zoned. It's in the NCD. It is an office use. That would be a different activity to make some proposals in regard to that. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but this is a result of the work that David Purcell has done. There may be some additional activity in that regard, but that's not part of this scope of work.
Any other questions? So when we get together next month, we'll be in a better position to go through the map and begin to discuss what your findings are over the course of the next couple of weeks. We'd appreciate if you'd take the time to do as Lee suggested, take a good look at these sheets and make sure that we've got the right flavors, both in terms of the forms of development. Right now, we're looking at traditional and suburban. We spend a lot of time as a staff trying to parse the development down into some categories. Anybody that's done that before probably knows it's, I'm going to throw out the word ontological nightmare. But we came up with 2 forms and 3 types, and we hope this is a good place to start in terms of characterizing these places and going forward to better define them and ultimately to come up with the zoning code that'll help us implement the plan itself. Absolutely, please visit other places if you haven't seen them before. I know we tried to hit a few of these in the tour this summer. And Lee, unless I'm wrong, I mean, as you think about these flavors, think back to the work that was done during the charrette and some of the examples of the parcel, the parcel types that we dealt with in the charrette and some of the concepts that were developed there. It helps you to visualize what might happen in some of those places under certain circumstances. Lee, do you want to add anything to that? Or?
Well, I just want to say that, if you recall, each of the charrette locations was chosen to play out a scenario that sort of fits into these ideas. So especially, transit south of Maine is both a very, very shallow and a shallow corridor. The Snyder portion is clearly, traditional node. The Gettsville portion, a suburban node, we hope, in its future characterization. It is a little bit today, and it could be more so in its future. So yes, I think you can look back to those elements, look at the way the transitions are proposed to happen to the neighborhoods, where in many cases we're transitioning to residential on what is currently commercial property, and adding that additional component to the commercial site to make it a better neighbor. You could look at some of those tools if you are concerned about some of these edge conditions. So yes, I would encourage you to look back at the set of drawings that are in there. It would be well worth rethinking those in light of how we characterize them here.
Any other questions, comments?
Before we adjourn, anybody in the general public would like to make some comments, and I'd ask that you follow the protocol that is established by the planning board and the town board to keep those comments to no longer than 3 minutes.
My name's Thomas Budd, and I met with Mayor Culpa last night regarding the Worley Drive corridor as far as the 6th or the 7th area that would go from Transit Road to Village of Williamsville. But also, it's important as far as the University of Buffalo One Region Boiler Project having to do with collaboration between the village and the town for the access for a project to relocate the two-way toll barrier, also having access from the county college, but also to remove the toll barrier on Transit Road and to convert and this was presented to the GBNRTC and the PCC part of the project, a long-term project for converting an adaptive reuse for the Amherst garbage dump on Narrow Drive, and to convert that park and ride, which they're calling for applications as far as statewide initiatives for the NYSERDA project that would turn that into to mitigate traffic on Main Street, but also to convert the Travel Plaza in Clarence to a visitor information center with a toll area. And that what it would do is, as far as the area affecting the municipalities, that it's an economic development project that Delaware North is interested in participating in, as far as the tourism development, as far as the opportunities long-term in western New York, as far as the history and the culture of Main Street and Ellicott Creek. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tommy. Just one last reminder, as we adjourn, the technical committee is meeting on February 8th, it's on your sheet, and that will be in Town Hall, and then we will be meeting as a working committee again on February 22nd, right here in the Village Hall. And by that time, I'm hoping that Dal Giuliani is back in the saddle. So, okay?
I forget what committee I'm on.
Pardon me?
I forget what committee I'm on.
You're on the working committee.
Okay.
Okay.
I just want to make sure.
Good. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.
Thanks, Rick.
Thanks, Lee.
So, Eric?